She's one of the most recognisable faces on Earth.
Absolutely the biggest superstar on the planet.
She really did light up a room.
Whose death shocked, upset and enraged the British people.
We seem to take leave of our senses in many ways.
It's the first time we've seen as a nation that kind of outpouring of public grief.
In her short life, Diana reshaped the relationship between royalty, the public and the press.
She was real.
And that influence has lived on long after her death.
It turned everything on its head. I think the events of what happened in that night in Paris in 1997 are probably ingrained on an entire generation.
I got a call from the office saying Diana had a crash in a car in Paris. Could I go to Paris first thing in the morning? And we landed in Paris at 4:30 and the phone rang, it was the office, and they said Diana's dead.
There was one of the biggest news events, perhaps, certainly in my lifetime.
Diana, Princess of Wales, has died, according to British sources.
One's heart goes out especially to the young princes, William and Harry.
We are today a nation in a state of shock. She was the people's princess, and that's how she will stay, how she will remain.
At that time, Princess Diana was by far the most newsworthy person on the planet. It was as though nothing else mattered. You know, the newspapers only covered that story until after the funeral.
In this country, we seem to take leave of our senses in many ways.
Oh, Jesus! Oh.
There were streams of people, and not only here in London, it was in France, in Paris, in Manchester, Leeds, everywhere. They had to import millions of balloons to keep up with the demand.
I think it was perhaps the first time we've seen as a nation that kind of outpouring of public grief for somebody that in the vast majority of the public's minds, they knew. You know, they might not have ever met her, but they felt like they knew Princess Diana.
One man who really did know the princess is fashion designer David Emanuel.
I'm David Emanuel. I suppose you could call me a royal couturier, but basically a fashion designer and broadcaster.
David and ex-wife Elizabeth were just 2 years out of the Royal College of Arts when the most famous woman in Britain stepped through the door of their small Mayfair studio.
She was a teenager, fresh, beautiful blue eyes, great skin, and a little bit, dare I say, a little bit of puppy fat. And she said, oh, I'm going somewhere. And I said, well, try this and try that and whatever. Only later to find out that the gown she'd chosen was for Prince Andrew's birthday at Buckingham Palace.
Several outfits later, the Emanuel team landed the design of the decade.
She rang the studio and asked, would we do the honour of making her wedding gown? And that's when the whole world went nuts. Literally, my tiny little studio in Brook Street was besieged. You know, it was everywhere. They were on the roofs opposite with big lenses and everything.
She was front page news if she wore a particular type of hair that day. You know, what she wore, what she said, let alone what she did, was front page news. Why was it front page news? It was front page news because the public demand for Princess Diana was overwhelming.
She was naturally herself. So when she stepped into the royal family, she did what was natural to her. She was caring. She never wore gloves. All the members of the royal family before, if they're going to an official, always had gloves on. She used to bend down and talk to the children. She was real.
When Diana smiled at you, you just got great pictures, and it was like a bang went off in your head. You knew you were going to be in the paper tomorrow. And it went on like that for 16, 17 years.
The public were enthralled. People wanted to know where she was going, who she was with, and what she was wearing.
She single-handedly put British fashion on the world map. Because all the foreign fashion buyers would come over. They'd go to Milan, they'd go to Italy, and they'd go to Paris. They never used to stop in London. until Diana came along. And then suddenly, we'd all mentioned in the press, you know, British, and she only wore British. So suddenly they go, oh, she's fabulous, we want some of that. So they'd stop in London to her designers and would be buying for the American market, whichever market it was. Whether she came out of the gym with a sweatshirt and lycra shorts on, or whether it's a soft little summer dress, whatever she wore, people ran out and bought, and they were sold out. And similarly, today, the Duchess of Cambridge has that effect. She wears high street as well as designer, expensive labels. And people are fascinated and they want part of that magic. She's a global icon. A global icon, now we look back, of style, beauty and compassion.
Understanding the immense power for good she could command from the front page of a newspaper, the princess pioneered a new relationship with the press.
Royals are front page news when they're bumps in their mother's tummy, and they will be front page news after their deaths. And all the space in between, you're going to potentially be front page news. What Princess Diana did was she was perhaps the first member of the royal family to start to own the agenda. If stuff's going to be written about you, then you might as well have some sort of influence on what it is that's written.
She came into the royal scene at 19, 20, and she grasped it, but she did it her way. And now everybody does it her way. The boys do it her way.
The ability that Princess Diana had developed to use the media for her own benefit became the stuff of legends. In the early 90s, late 80s, when the stigma around HIV and AIDS was one of the most shocking things about this new disease that picked its targets at random. That stigma was broken by Princess Diana because she knew, as she sat and held the hand of someone dying of AIDS, that for the vast majority of right-thinking members of the public, they would see that these people are the victims of a horrendous disease.
She knew if she was up front, it would be reported whether it was, you know, the Red Cross, whether it's AIDS.
Princess Diana, like a wrecking ball, showed how fame within your position as a member of the royal family can make a fundamental difference on those key issues. It's fascinating for me now to see the way that Harry and Meghan, in many of their discussions and how they come across, is what they are doing. They are a couple who have accepted they're going to be written about. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to own what's written about them.
But it wasn't just in her relationship with the press that Diana broke royal convention. She was famously a committed and doting mother to her two boys, an anchor for them through the peaks and troughs of extreme royal privilege and the immense pressure that accompanies it.
It was always very clear, and we look back at old footage now and we can just see that magical sort of bond between Harry, William and their mother. You know, certainly for Princess Diana, whilst the royal stuff was important, for her it was never her overriding priority. Her priority was to be a mother to the boys. And I think a lot of people will probably say, well, thank God for that, because clearly that wasn't the Queen's priority when she had her children.
Occasionally we'd be doing fittings in Kensington Palace. I heard this noise. She goes, I'm sorry, they were playing upstairs, the princes, with children, you know, running around. And I said, gosh, this awful noise, what's going on? And she said, I'm sorry, it's the boys, you know. And so she was very real.
The prince would take them to the opera and Shakespeare, but she would take them to McDonald's and the pictures.
Diana was the mother that would take them off and they'd eat sweets until, you know, they'd almost hurl up. You know, that kind of mother that was there to just, yeah, let's just do this. Yeah, we're not really allowed, but let's do it. I mean, the death of Princess Diana removed from those boys that person that they could all be a little bit rebellious with. That thing, that wonderful connection that you would have with that person, that went when she died.
It was a sad day, a very sad day. Probably of all what I've covered, over the years, it was the saddest day. People all over the world tuned in, not here, the most remotest part of Africa, Pakistan, everywhere. People just switched on to watch that funeral.
They look so young, you know, Prince Harry and Prince William. You get them thinking, I wonder what they're feeling, I wonder what they're thinking. And I mean, I think it was terribly brave of them to walk behind their mother's coffin. But I think people respected that.
The death of their mother has totally defined both William and Harry's life. Not only because it's incredibly traumatic to lose your mother, Harry was only 12, William 15, but also because they had to expose their grief to millions of people who were watching the procession when the two boys walked behind their mother's coffin. Prince William keeps his feelings more to himself, and Prince Harry has always had his heart on his sleeve. You have two boys who come from the same family, have the same experience, but their own genes and their own way of thinking can make a very different outcome.
The difference with Harry and William was that not that long after Diana died, William was at university in a normal environment.
He insisted on going into dorms at the university. He was offered a huge flat with lots of staff. He didn't want that. He wanted to start at the beginning and try to find another way of living positively. He said that sometime later, I saw my mother's death and I was not going to let it break me. I was determined to let it make me.
Gradually with William, we saw him, through his relationship with Kate, over a period of years, come to terms quietly with the acceptance that he will be a future king and that that is his destiny and that he can't do anything about that, so it's his.
And then I think, to his luck and very good judgment, he met Kate's family, and from there he could start a new life because he could see how you could have a different sort of family. You could have a family who supported you, a family who was easygoing with you, a family who cared about you, and didn't shout at each other. The husband and wife didn't shout at each other. And he learned a lot from how to relax. He's felt very much at home there. He's been on holidays with them. He sees them a lot. Even at the engagement interview, he said how wonderful they'd been to him to let him in. And I think this cannot be underestimated, the importance of this. He'd only had the experience really of a dysfunctional family arguing. And here he had a very relaxed, warm, encompassing family.
Well, of course, Harry didn't have that. He had a series of unsuccessful relationships, a period in the army, and as we now know by his own words, a period of being totally lost, angry, damaged, confused.
No one really took responsibility for Harry's state of health over a long period. There were lots of different people, and so he became a terrible rebel. He said to me that he wanted to be a bad boy at Eton. He wasn't interested in his classes, and he was just smoking from the age of 12 and drinking a lot. And the grief and the anger built up inside him, of course.
In 2008, an inquest into Princess Diana's death concluded that she and partner Dodi Al-Fayed had been unlawfully killed, in part due to the gross negligence of the driver of their vehicle. The verdict came after 11 years of speculation, rumour and conspiracy theories that Prince Harry found difficult to deal with.
It hurt him badly. He was damaged by her death. A 12-year-old mother dies, 12-year-old suffers, obviously, poor chap. But then to have 11 years, over a decade, of his mother's death being the stuff of open discussions and theories, and this is what happened and that's what happened. You know, from Prince Harry's point of view, he was like a volcano waiting to erupt. For Harry, the statement that the palace issued on his behalf, that was for Harry the explosion, you know, inside. He wasn't able to have his own voice. He wasn't even allowed to have his say 11 years after her death. 2 days after that statement was released, as the inquest ended in 2008, Harry attended his cousin's stag do on the Isle of Wight, Peter Phillips's stag do, and I was covering it as a journalist, and as part of that I managed to spend about an hour or so talking to Harry, and at the time, you know, really didn't report it because it was all very private stuff. Subsequently, I've heard him say it to Oprah Winfrey and Spotify and Netflix and whoever else is paying the bills for him these days. So I don't want to betray any confidences, but yes, his view was that he was silenced by his father and his father's advisors over the one thing that if Prince Harry, of all people, should be entitled to talk about and have an opinion and say his piece, it was the circumstances of the inquest into his own mother's death. It doesn't surprise me really at all that where Harry is at now, now that he's married, now that he's a father himself, which is a significant moment in his life. Those precious memories of her in the last few years of her life are memories of a woman at war with the royals. They are memories of a woman who felt everyone had an opinion on her and she wasn't allowed her own. You know, somebody else would decide what it is Princess Diana should do. Harry remembers that vividly. So, you know, perhaps if I was asked, for example, well, would Diana support Harry in going to America? Well, you know, there's a lot of ifs and buts. Of course, we're talking about years of things that would have happened. But it would be pretty much, I would say, unthinkable for Princess Diana not to support Prince Harry, to walk away from an institution that in the last 2 years of her life, that's what she was doing. Harry is the living, breathing epitome of Diana's legacy in Harry's mind. So it doesn't matter whether we think Diana would have supported Harry doing what he's done. Harry knows in his heart she would, because by escaping the royal family, by sticking 2 fingers up to the institution, what's Harry doing? He's doing exactly what he remembers his mother doing in the last 2 years of her life.